Everyone loves a Cinderella story, but in real life, they don't always have a happy ending. And none more so than the life of Lady Emma Hamilton. How does a Georgian woman rise from the most ordinary upbringing to the very top of society with a man she loved and have it all taken away? Join me as I retrace her footsteps from her life in London and tell her story from the streets she walked over 200 years ago. Let's go! Born Amy Lyon in 1765 to an illiterate blacksmith in Cheshire, Emma Hamilton, as she came to be known, was drawn to the bright lights of London at only 12 years old. A stagecoach trip to the Old Smoke saw her hired as an undermaid to the Budd family at Chatham Place in Blackfriars. The area was a lot different in 1777, but if you squint, the row of townhouses would have had a similar view out to Southwark across the River Thames. Here, she boarded with a budding actress, Jane Powell, and it's said that they auditioned for a few tragedy roles together in the West End. Sacked, after only a year, the two were cut adrift into the seedy world of Covent Garden. These days, visitors searching for the elusive garden will find only high-end retail and fancy restaurants, whose prices are often buffered by the tourist tax. In the 18th century, however, eyebrows were being raised for other reasons entirely. It was a buzzing centre of glittering West End theatres, peppered with slums and bursted with brothels. It's hard to believe that Seven Dials was a notorious slum at the time. That's not to say that Emma ever worked the streets. She's known to have worked as a maid to the actresses at Drury Lane Theatre. Jane Powell went on to find fame as an actress, while Emma took an entirely different path to celebrity. During her year or so slumming it in Covent Garden, it's rumoured that the now 13 or 14-year-old Emma did a few odd jobs for the quack doctor called James Graham, who had cooked up an inventive sex therapy unit called the Temple of Health at the Adelphi in the Strand. Inside the temple, fertility challenge couples would pay handsomely for the use of the electrically charged bed, and the afflicted gentlemen would watch dancers dressed as classical figures to stimulate their recovery. The less said about this, the better. But these unique performances would come to serve Emma well late in life. She was putting herself out there, and her talents didn't go unnoticed. She was snapped up by the infamous Madame Kelly as a dancer for one of her most upmarket brothels on Arlington Street, right under the nose of St James's Palace in Mayfair. Sadly, much of the Georgian architecture has been and gone, but a few buildings remain to paint the picture for us. Miss Kelly, also known as Charlotte Hayes, has a remarkable story of her own. She was born in a brothel, became a prostitute, then the most desired woman in London, then hustled away to being the most prolific, high-class madam of the age. And residence in a flagship establishment on this street would be akin to a place on the top shelf for the affections of Georgian sugar daddies, the young men of the aristocracy. Being especially beautiful and charismatic, Miss Lyon, as Emma was known, caught the eye of Sir Harry Fernshaw, a man noteworthy only for his appetite for a party. He hired Emma as a mistress at his Sussex-based country estate, UPPARK, where she was thrust into the lifestyle of the upper classes. As a man with a taste for excess, the parties were famous, and Emma is said to have danced nude for the guests from time to time, on tables. Even this wasn't enough to turn Sir Harry's attention from boozing, and he frequently ignored her in favour of partying and hunting. His objectification of Emma ended in the summer of 1871, when she became pregnant with his child. He had to get rid. Prior to this abandonment, Emma had become friendly with a rather more straight-laced Honourable Charles Francis Greville. He decided that he would take her on as a mistress if she agreed to foster the child out at the earliest opportunity. She agreed and moved to his London home in Paddington Green. These days, only a couple of these Georgian townhouses still overlook Paddington Green, and the area was considered rural at the time. So locked away in obscurity, Greville demanded that Emma cast away her wicked ways of yesteryear and present the world of a meek, virtuous woman in the mould of his idealism. She complied. She changed her name to Emma Hart and was only permitted to meet a handful of people, an important exception being a famous artist, George Romney. George's home was where this Pret stands today on Cavendish Square. It seems a recurring theme that Prets are popping up in these historic locations. In Emma, Romney found his muse. He painted in excess of 80 portraits of her. The passionate quality of these paintings amplified Emma's beauty and personality to the masses, and she soon became famous in the social circles across the city, much to the chagrin of Greville, who wanted their relationship to be kept on the lowdown. He had to get rid if he was ever to find a respectable wife, specifically one with money, so he had a cunning plan. He arranged to foist her off as a mistress to his uncle, Sir William Hamilton, British envoy to Naples. Hamilton was well aware of her famous beauty and made the arrangements for her to stay in Naples. Blissfully unaware of the transaction, Emma was initially furious when she found out about Greville's plan, but she slowly warmed to the 55-year-old Hamilton. Against all odds, they fell in love, and shortly after, they returned to London to be married at the Marylebone Parish Church. The original church was replaced with this magnificent example a few years after the wedding, and with the King's approval, the marriage meant that Emma had a new title of Lady Hamilton, the one she stuck with till the bitter end. They returned to Naples, where Emma took her role in her stride, becoming famously good friends with the Queen of Naples, and taking the whole of Europe by storm with her unique performance depicting classical heroines by rearranging her scarf in cunning ways. It created a fashion revolution and a new dance trend, all this without TikTok. The French Revolutionary War was beginning to affect Naples, and while acting briefly as a spy for the Queen, her path crossed with the rising British naval hero, Horatio Nelson. It was this moment that Nelson had met the woman who would be his muse and obsession for the rest of his life. They were besotted from the off, with her husband Sir Hamilton a great admirer of Nelson, and being a great deal older than Emma, he accepted the situation, and they formed a peculiar ménage à trois. Horatio and Emma were now the most famous couple in Britain, the nation's war hero with an international fashion icon. One slight snag, Horatio was already married to Fanny Nelson, a woman that he tossed aside without a second thought on his return to London with the Hamiltons. They all stayed at Nerot's Hotel on King Street, just a street or two away from the brothel that Emma worked in as a teenager. The building has since been dismantled, not unlike Nelson's marriage when Fanny learned of his betrayal. Emma was visibly pregnant with Horatio's child, and Fanny was unsurprisingly disturbed by the sight. The press had a field day with Sir Hamilton, but he was unperturbed, and the Hamiltons moved into 22 Grosvenor Square. Horatio rented a place down the road on Dover Street with his wife, who he now treated with contempt. A short while later, the Hamiltons moved to 23 Piccadilly, where Nelson was called out to sea again. Before leaving, he was faced with an ultimatum from Fanny. He defiantly chose Emma. Emma gave birth to Nelson's daughter, Horatia, on the 29th of January 1801, and the child was entrusted in the care of Mrs. Gibson here on Little Titchfield Street. The name might have been some clue as to who the father was. They were desperate to get out of the public eye. Nelson also had the problem of the playboy Prinny, Prince Regent, who openly had his eye on Emma. It was all getting a bit much. So Nelson bought Merton Place, with a vision of a life on the outskirts of London, and Emma spared no expense in turning it into the dream home suitable for their public standing. And indeed, it was Nelson who dubbed it Paradise Merton. Sadly, nothing remains of this home now but a small park with a memorial. Merton has become decidedly less rural in the last 200 years. In its full glory, it was surrounded by a moat with a bridge and 52 acres of land. The church they frequented, however, remains happily untouched, and inside, Horatio and Emma's pews are still there today. Emma had also taken up a town residence on Clarges Street in Mayfair for the sake of appearances, but Merton was still where they dreamt of finding happiness together. Of course, this domestic joy was short-lived, as Admiral Nelson sailed up once again to square up to Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar, masterminding a famous and decisive victory against all odds. Relics from the battle can be found across London in the form of several French cannon used as bollards. Yeah, really. A couple can be found today in Southwark and at St. Helen's Church in Bishopsgate. This great victory came at a heavy price though. Horatio was fatally shot by a sharpshooter in the final moments of the battle, and he was sailed home preserved in a cask of brandy. You can see his uniform at the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, London, bullet hole and all. Naturally, Lord Nelson's estate went to his family, and the press took an unfavourable eye on Emma, who they considered the homewrecker of the martyred admiral. She was running out of money and increasingly turning to drink to cope with her situation and the grief of her loss. Spiralling debts forced her to downsize from Clarges Street to a rented apartment on Bond Street, where despite a few fundraisers keeping her afloat, she had no choice to eventually flee to Calais in 1825. She died alone in squalid conditions in a single room. Such is the fame that Nelson had. Emma often gets unfairly boxed as an opportunist temptress, but as we've seen, there was a lot more to her story than that. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please give me a like and a subscribe. That'll encourage me to go out and find some more histories. I think we might go a bit more modern this time. Okay, see you next time.